I'm delighted today to welcome to our center speaker series Mesrob Vartavarian, who is currently an instructor at Mount St. Mary's University, but he has UCLA roots. He did an MA here in history as well as a BA in history prior to that, and so we've welcomed him here a couple of times in the last few years on various topics, and so it's a delight to have you here again, Mesrob. He is currently, I believe, according to your CV, working on a book project entitled Coercion and Co-optation, Policing British India, 1800 to 1860. How far along is that?
It's coming.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yes.
So we can look forward to that. His talk today is entitled An Islamic Resurgence, Political Violence in the Southern Philippines. And that's all I know about it, so I'm looking forward to this talk. And so without further ado, thank you again for coming and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, George, and thank you all for coming. So today, just to kind of dive right into it, my presentation or lecture is in 3 steps. I will basically be kind of tracing the long-term causes of the current crisis as it's unfolded in the southern Philippines in recent months, namely the kind of drawn-out and very bloody siege of Marawi City on the island of Mindanao, which has its roots dating all the way back to the American colonial advent in the southern Philippines. Then I will be focusing on the more short-term roots of this crisis, which began around 1972 and continued into the early 2000s. And then I will have something to say, at least about the role of the United States and the projection of American power into the southern Philippines in the present time. So, to begin with the long-term causes, it's terribly important to consider that the colonial experience in the southern Philippines was very distinct from the colonial experience of other parts of the Philippines, right? Those zones that we consider Christian and lowland, those zones that were converted by the Spaniards beginning in the 16th and fairly deep into the 17th century, were treated in a different manner from the unconquered, or if you like, unpacified regions of the Philippines, which by and large remain Muslim. There is a kind of upland pagan element to this, a tribal lumad, as they say, element to all of this unconquered parts of the Philippines, but I'll leave that to one side for the current purposes. Fundamentally, the ideology that inspired American administrators in the southern Philippines, who were army officers rather than civilian politicians or civilian political colonial functionaries, was one of progressivism and modernization. Progressivism and modernization in a very high imperial context, of course. So fundamentally, rather than sectarianize the difference between Muslims and Christians in the Philippines, there was a racialization of that distinction. The concept being essentially that these are savages, in the words of the American military officials of the time, who lacked a degree of civilization that was present in the Christian zones. And it was the mandate, if you like, of the army officers that administered Muslims in the South to modernize them to the extent that they could stand up on their own 2 feet and be assimilated into mainstream Philippine society, crucially, while remaining Muslim. They had to become modern, but they had to remain Muslim. That was the ideology, that was the very kind of the panacea that was presented to Muslims themselves, Filipinos in the Christian areas, and indeed to the American public too. If you read the press of the time, there is this kind of notion that America too has its civilizing mission, much like other European powers, the French in Indochina, the British in India, Africa, and so on and so forth. What this means on the ground, however, is something quite different, because fundamentally the modernization of the Muslim populations of the southern Philippines rendered these people vulnerable to external control, first American control, and then indeed Christian Philippine control, as I will get to. All right. Now, the facilitators, the middlemen, the kind of people that made all of this possible are the datus of the southern Philippines. Datus meaning the chieftains of the southern Philippines. As was common in other colonial ventures, in Africa certainly, and in various parts of Asia and Southeast Asia, those aspects of the elite, the indigenous elite on the ground, that had a less illustrious lineage, and please understand, of course, that lineage is terribly important in the Muslim Philippines, also in Muslim Southeast Asia, the tarsila, the genealogies that these datus were constructing, elaborating, indeed fabricating more often than not, of course, linked them to the Prophet Muhammad, and indeed linked them to Sayyids, people who were descended from the Prophet Muhammad and came to the southern Philippines to convert it to Islam. Generally, the Americans, for any number of reasons, did not choose to make alliances with the most illustrious of the aristocracy, the Muslim aristocracy that they encountered. It was more the up-and-coming parvenu spectrum or segment that they chose to ally with, and indeed substantially empower. All right? So from 1899, roughly, to about 1913, you have a dual process. You have a contraction of the indigenous Muslim elite in the southern Philippines, but those datus that remain become more powerful than ever before. So while the numbers of datus is contracting, the power that is available to those datus that remain are indeed much greater. And they are far more secure in their tenure because they are backed up, thoroughly backed up, by American colonial firepower, which was substantial, to say the least. Right? And again, there are various examples of how this plays out. If you look at the southern Philippines under American rule, it's not quite the uniform experience you get in most of the scholarly literature. There is a substantial variation between different sub-regions of this Muslim region. So for example, Cotabato, the Cotabato River Basin, which has a more natural geography, it was easier to empower Datu Piang, all right, of the Sultanate of Buayan, who was associated with that sultanate, and make him the local strongman through which you could run this colonial state. In a place like the Sulu Archipelago, as we still see today, it was much, much harder a place to pacify, a much more fragmented geography, a much more porous frontier, and hence much more violent. Again, we make these are tricky distinctions, I know, but just to entertain the notion, we tend to assume that the infliction of violence is a sign of colonial strength, a sign of colonial deliberate imposition of domination. But indeed, we can say in the Sulu Archipelago, where the worst violence took place, I think that was more a function of colonial weakness and maybe even insecurity. This island chain, which had a very long history of raiding, piracy, smuggling, banditry of all sorts, had to be brought to order, and in the minds of the American military officers who ran it, the only way it could be brought to order was through brutality, through extreme levels of violence and counterinsurgency, if you want to use that terminology. So there are two aspects to this. As I've elaborated on, there is the contraction of power into the hands of fewer and fewer Muslim datus, and also crucially, there is a disarmament of the population that the American authorities carry out. Not entirely, but substantially. All right. So, when all kinds of political pressures come to the fore in 1912, 1913, and into 1914, not to get too sidetracked into American politics, but essentially the victory of the Democratic Party in the 1912 election, the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson in 1913, initiates a sort of formal decolonization process in the Philippines, which will take several decades to unfold, because the Democratic Party had a very different notion of how American power should be exercised, more informally rather than blatantly colonially, if you like. However, essentially the removal of American military government from the southern Philippines results in a situation of what increasingly is a popular phrase used with scholars of South Asia and Africa, it results in a sub-colonial situation. A sub-colonial situation. Something that is only now really getting the attention it deserves from scholars of empire and colonialism. Meaning essentially, within a broad imperial framework, there is a colonialism within colonialism. So, the Americans continue to be the overlords of the Philippines, if you like. It is still their imperial possession. Some say it's still their imperial possession, indeed, in various ways. But within that overarching suzerainty, if you like, to use a very British colonial term, there are spaces that are left for indigenous elites, indeed Christian indigenous elites, to colonize, to be colonial masters themselves, hence this term sub-colonialism. And the Muslim South was subjected to a form of Christian sub-colonial rule, all right? And it's not just in the form of viceroys civilizing savage Moros. There is increasingly also a settler element to this, a settler colonial aspect to this sub-colonial endeavor or stream of development. All right? However, there are limits to what the Christian colonials can do in Mindanao. All right? Because the Americans are there, you have essentially a kind of triangular formation, which endures until 1946. 1942 with the Japanese invasion, but then the reconquest of the Philippines by the United States military, and then the final letting go of that colony, if you like. What was left of its residual colonial influence was surrendered on to a Christian elite